Okay, this is Jerry Logan today talking about Chapter 3 Culture and Media in the Introduction to Sociology course. So let me begin by stating this particular chapter talks about culture and the impact of the media and the culture. First, let me start out with the definition of culture. Culture, of course, is the language, the beliefs, values, norms. Remember, norms are expectations of right behavior. Behaviors and even material objects that characterize a group and are passed from one generation to the next. It is also the sum of social categories and concepts we embrace in addition to our beliefs, the behaviors, even instinctual ones and practices, everything but the natural environment around us. And culture does include the technology by which humans have come to dominate nature and the belief systems and symbolic representations that constitute human existence. So when we go back to the definition of culture, every culture is a lot of cultures are different, and we'll talk about subcultures a little bit later. But subcultures has a lot to do with traditions as well. In different cultures, we have different languages that we speak because this is a global economy, so this is across the world. There are different languages, there are different distinct cultures. Each culture has a belief system, the values which they uphold, and the norms, again, expectations of right behavior. And these also include material objects that characterize a group. So when they say pass from one generation to a next, let's say, for instance, a culture has to do with, if you look at your own family culture, there may be some traditions that are being passed on from one generation to the next. So I've had students from across the world who share with me the different experiences they had in their culture. So, for instance, in some culture, there's one particular case. There was a student who talked about how that there was a family recipe that their great great grandmother had, and they passed it down to the oldest child, female child. So at the time, her mother had the recipe, but at the same time, it will be passed to her. So there are also different stories of material objects such as a family Bible, certain type of material things such as a family talked about silverware that was being passed down, family traditions, family holiday, holidays that come up. There may be family traditions that come in. One student talked about every year during Thanksgiving, they would have a football game outside. So it's a tradition in the family that they would have this big football game, and he stated that once he has children, he would continue on the tradition because it's been going on for years. So remember that each family has a distinct cultural uh, part of their family, and they do have patterns and things that they do that they pass on from one generation to the next. Remember as well, we also talk about technology. Technology has also evolved. So the culture of the younger people today, compared to for my generation growing up in the 70s, 1970s, technology has changed a lot. So we didn't have cell phones back then. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have laptops and things like that, cell phones. So we think about the culture, how it's changed, especially from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s until today. So a lot of young people who have a PS4 going on getting a PS5 now, that they have access to video games and they have access to the internet. And years ago, we would never thought about things like that, especially in my household. But we would never thought about things where you would have this type of technology that we have today. So the culture of the technology will continue to be advanced as we go on in the future. So a lot of the students in younger age, 19, 18, 20 years old, by the time you become parents and you have children in their 20s, technology is going to be so far advanced. So culture also does include the technology as well. Next slide. There are two types of culture. There's the material culture. Of course, it talks about objects that distinguish a group, such as their art, but different parts of art that comes. If you look at even the architectural structures of some buildings, in particular, there may be artwork, the weapons that they use. If we can go back historically to a hunting and gathering society, utensils, machines, the hairstyles are totally different from the 1970s. especially when I had a big afro, compared to now. The clothing that we have, and then the jewelry that we wear as well. Everything that is part of our constructed physical environment, including the technology. I was sharing with the students the material culture when I was growing up in the 70s. The clothing I had, big polyester. Polyester was big as far as the butterfly collars, bell bottom pants. Then it went over to the 80s, how it went over to when, Timberland boots, the designer jeans were big. I think it was more the 90s, but the 80s was more like the breakdancing days, and I had this long jerry curl. Things that were going on back then. So we see that the culture has changed if you look today to the young people compared to what it was years ago. Also, the natural objects and materials, they say rock, dirt, trees, aren't considered to be part of material culture. However, people view natural objects and how to use them as well. So that is a material culture. We're looking at material objects that distinguish a group of people. Excuse me. Non-material culture, that's a group way of thinking, including its beliefs, values, social norms, and other assumptions about the world, and doing so as common patterns of behavior, including their language and other forms of interaction. It's also called a symbolic culture. Includes the social roles, rules, ethics, and beliefs are just some examples. Now, all of them are crucial guides for members of a culture to use to know how to behave in their society and interpret the world. So we go back into years ago, the non-material culture, group way of thinking. We look back in the 60s, 70s. It was more of a radical civil rights movement was going on in the 60s and protests and of the wars. Like I say, protests in the Vietnam War. Some of our students, they laugh about it and say, well, back in the day, they were hippies. So there was different social norms and beliefs and values going on at each time. So throughout the new non-material cultures, the group's way of thinking compared to what's going on today. So if you compare the time frames throughout history, the non-material culture has changed, even though some of the issues may still arrive. But however, that we look at this as a way of, what's going on with the time of the culture and the time frame of that period. So the non-material culture, again, is a group way of thinking. The material culture is material objects, and the non-material is just a group's way of thinking. But all cultures also share common elements. Cultural universals are patterns of traits that are globally common in all societies. So a lot of the cultural universals is just some of the things that you can see from one culture to the next, across culturally to other cultures across the world. Some of these same patterns are still consistent. So remember that is the cultural universal. Culture shock. It is a disorientation that people experience when they come in contact with a fundamentally different culture and they no longer depend on their taken for granted assumptions about life. They say it leads to some doubt, confusion, or anxiety arising from an immersion in an unfamiliar culture. So culture shock is something you experience from another culture. I use the example if someone will go to the Amish community who's not familiar with that, and you go to the Amish community and it's like, okay, well, I need a place to plug up my cell phone. And if there's a traditional Amish community where there's no use of electricity, some people might say, wow, that's different. Or if you travel to another country, I've heard about different experiences from different students who they went to maybe a third world country where there was no running water, no plumbing. They had to go down the street, walk blocks to carry water from a source of water, bodily water, whether it be a river or something like that. That's where they get their water from. There are also cases where students had explained to me they went to another culture. They seen younger kids go purchase alcohol, younger kids driving cars, or some of the things that's just, that you're not familiar in your current culture, that you experience this culture shock when you come in contact with a different culture. The part when you start trying to judge it and criticize in some way or the negative evaluation of the value, norms, and behavior of another one's culture based upon your own is ethnocentrism. So if someone were to go to the Amish community and say, hey, this don't make no sense, how they living, I don't get it, this is a negative evaluation, a negative opinion, Then you're practicing a form of ethnocentrism, with the beliefs in a form that your culture group is more superior or is the correct way to do things. So if you're a culture and you've been socialized into an Amish community, and there can be a culture shock and you come to another area and say, wow, I didn't know this exists, or I've never experienced this before. But the ethnocentrism is when you have a belief and you begin to judge, even criticize in a negative way about the other culture based upon your own culture. So make sure you're familiar with culture shock and ethnocentrism. Culture relativism is a little bit different, as you see, is relativism as relating to the culture. So now you're beginning to relate to the culture. You're not judging the culture, but you're trying to understand it on its own terms. You understand there are differences across culture, but you're not passing judgment or passing value. So therefore, say, oh, I'm going to go to the Amish community where I understand how they live. I'm learning to accept it. It's not in a negative way. And you say, well, there are differences, but it's functioning and people are happy with it. They've been socialized into this culture and it's something comfortable. So there's no reason to judge it because that culture have their own reasons for doing so. But at this time, as you see, culture relativism is where you begin to relate to the culture. Make sure you're familiar with that as well. For instance, here's an example I had pulled out before, culture relativism. People do the bullfighting is a form of culture. They say many Americans, I think I say many, some Americans may perceive bullfighting as a cruel activity that should be illegal everywhere, but to certain cultures, bullfighting is a sport that they say pits the matador and bull in a unifying image of power, courage, and glory. It requires that we suspend our own perspectives in order to grasp the perspectives of others. They say something easier described than attained. That is a very brave man out there. I don't think I know I wouldn't be out there doing it. But if you've been socialized and raised in the culture, you begin to understand the importance of it and not sit back, practicing ethnocentrism, but you're really doing a cultural relativism, and you'll see how important the bullfighting is as part of a culture. Symbolic culture is another term. It's another term for non-material culture. Now, remember we talked about symbols, something at which people attach a meaning to, and we communicate with one another. We talked about this in symbolic interactionism. So there's a way with the use of symbols that you're able to not even sometimes even express words with each other, but you can look at a symbol and know exactly what it means. I used an example earlier in the other chapter. We talked about someone has a wedding band on, someone has a priest collar. There may be symbols of you're driving a vehicle. You might say, okay, this is a red light, this is a green light, this is a stop sign. There can be other forms of symbol, but cross-culturally, it varies. But just I always tell people to make sure you understand that. I talk about that with gestures. So remember, symbols are something we attach meaning to, and we use it to communicate with one another. Gestures, on the other hand, is the way people use their bodies to communicate with one another. You can use body language, hand gestures, facial expressions. You can convey messages without words. You can you have a certain look on your face. You can have a puzzled look on your face, an angry look on your face, and someone knows exactly what you mean. Or you can use some type of hand gesture to say, thumbs up, I'm okay, I understand, wave goodbye to someone. So those are other ways in which we use gestures. We use our body in ways of communicating. And not only you convey messages without the words, but remember gestures can mean different things among different cultures. And I just challenge students that when you get a chance, just kind of do some research and look up cross-culturally what are some of the gestures that vary in one culture to another. So there are certain hand signs, symbols you can use with your hands that may mean one thing in your own culture, but in another culture means something totally different, which could be considered as disrespectful. So I would just tell students, just kind of Google sometimes and say, hey, find out what's cross-cultural, especially if you plan on visiting another country or experiencing another culture. What are some of the things that you can learn, especially not to, as they say here, lead to a misunderstanding where you're thinking you're doing one thing and it's like, oh, this culture's like, oh, you can't do that. So make sure you just do that and just take fun, take some time, have some fun, and just kind of see how gestures vary across cultures and how they can lead to a misunderstanding as well. Language is important through our culture. There's a symbol. Language is a symbol of symbols that can be combined in an infinite number of ways and can represent not only objects but also abstract thought. So language is very important. Allows the human experience to be cumulative. So remember the language, and I kind of like not just cross culturally speaking a so-called different language. So someone in this country may speak this language, and as this person speaks French, this one speaks Spanish, this one speaks English. So language does come with the culture, but if you look at it a little bit different, sometimes the language on the culture can be a little bit different, and people within the culture can have their own language. So there is a form of slang that certain cultures may use, or even a subculture. There may be certain language that provides a social shared past, social or shared future. It allows shared perspectives and allows shared goal-oriented behavior. So language is very important in the culture. But like I said, not only represent objects but also abstract thought. So make sure you're familiar with language. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is based on the idea that people experience their world through their language, and what they therefore understand their world through the culture embedded in language. Uh, the hypothesis, which is called the linguistic relativity, states that the language shapes the thought. So this is another way people experience the world based upon their language, and they understand their world based upon what's embedded in their culture and in language as well. So be familiar with this as well. Both. Values, the standard by which people define what is desirable or undesirable, good or bad, ugly or beauty, moral beliefs. So this is the standards in a culture. We value this in our country. We value this in our culture. We value this. This is good. This is bad. So you have certain values that you have to keep in mind and be familiar. And a lot of times we are socialized into our culture, and we are socialized to learn the values of the culture. So you would have to understand and that is a moral belief system that which is upheld in that particular culture. Norms, as I stated earlier, is expectations of right behavior, how values tell us to behave. So norms is not so much like a law or anything, but it's expectation. So for instance, a norm is for gentlemen, we open the door for ladies when they come in. So you going up to a door, you open the door for her. That's the norm of expectation of right behavior. I know as I grew up. Expectations of right behavior, things that we should and value as part of the culture, but as people see that, like this is the norm of what you're supposed to be doing. Now, sanctions are either expressions of approval given to people for upholding the norm or expressions of disapproval to people who violate them. Positive sanction is a reward, a positive reaction to follow the norms. You can smile to someone or give a material reward to them if they're following the norm in a positive way. Negative sanction, the expression of disapproval for breaking the norm. They say it can vary range from a mild informal reaction such as a frown to a formal reaction such as they go to the extreme of a prison sanction. So make sure you understand that not values, norms, and sanctions, and sanctions can be either positive or negative. Folkways, I put them in bold letters. These are norms. Remember, norms are expectations of right behavior that are not strictly enforced. Mores is pronounced mores, norms that are strictly enforced because they are thought essential to core values of the well-being of the group. So it is the norm that are either restricted or not restricted. So we're looking at a folkway, norms that are not strictly enforced. The folkway, trying to get an example for a folkway is like, you're supposed to wear a black tie to a black tie affair. Nobody's they're gonna look at you just like, oh, you're supposed to wear it, but it's not as strictly enforced. If someone goes to a sporting event, The guys come in, we come in with shirts on. The baseball game, you take it off during the games. That's not folk way. Usually we're supposed to have it, but it's not strictly enforced. The opposite of mores, norms that are strictly enforced. So make sure you know the difference between a folk way and a more. But I put them in bold letters, capitalized, not strictly enforced for a folk way, and mores are strictly enforced. So a taboo is a norm so strong that it often brings revulsion and violated. It's something that can be pretty bad. A taboo to the extent, use the example of the incident of Jeffrey Dahmer. That would be considered the norm of a taboo that is like, wow, this guy was actually a cannibal. So that is an example of a taboo um, that people are like, wow, you're not supposed to do this. This is insane. So at the same time, it is a very strict norm to violate. Moral holiday. A moral holiday is a holiday from everyday conventions and morals, an occasion, a ritual, a time of year, whatever, when the many of the common rules and customs are willfully ignored and flouted. Moral holidays include Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is a time of the event in Louisiana and New Orleans where people are like, okay, they bend the rules a little bit. You may not get arrested. You got certain things such as championship celebrations of sports. Remember the Cubs won the World Series. You can see on TV, because the Cubs haven't won in 100 years, but as you can see on TV how people were outside celebrating, drinking, but they were even standing next to a police officer, drinking a beer. Ordinarily you get arrested for it, but because it's a moral holiday, they kind of ease back a little bit. Some people say St. Patrick's Day, and one of my students mentioned the movie The Purge, in which he said, well, that would be a moral holiday. Because they set aside that one time of the year in which they relax the rules and customs. And unfortunately, if you have people haven't seen the movie, I'm sure a lot of people have seen the movie The Purge, but if you use that as an example of that would be considered as a moral holiday. It's not encouraged, which we should not have it as a holiday at all. It shouldn't occur. But as an example, moral holiday in which the laws are more relaxed, the common rules and customs, they say are willfully ignored. I think I put it twice. High culture is to describe the pattern of culture experience and attitudes that exist in the highest class segments of a society. So the high culture, people often associate high culture with intellectualism, political power, and prestige. In America, high culture also tends to be associated with the wealthy. So it's more of the high class segments of the society, the culture, experience, and attitudes that exist if you from this particular society, high class society, so to say, and then you'll experience that as a high culture. Popular culture refers to the pattern of culture, experience, and attitudes that exist in mainstream society. Popular culture events might include a parade, baseball game, and a season finale of a television show. Rock and pop music, pop is short for popular, and it's part of the popular culture. It is often expressed and spread via commercial media such as radio, television, movies, the music industry, publishers, and corporate run websites. Unlike high culture, popular culture is known and accessible to most people. So make sure you're familiar with popular culture and high culture. Subculture. There are thousands of subcultures out there. Culture within a culture. The values and related behaviors of a group that distinguishes members from the larger culture or world within the world. It is the distinct culture, values, and behavior patterns of a particular group in society. So when I mentioned there are different types of subcultures, a culture within a culture. There are people who are gamers. I'm not familiar with the whole gaming thing, but there are certain events that people, there are gamers across the world, so a lot of people in the video games, they can tell you back and forth about which video game came out, which is coming up, what's the difference, so it's a lot of work into that. But however, there's a culture, a subculture of gamers that they have their own language in a sense. They understand the terminologies, they understand everything that they do. They have these big events where there's a lot of gamers come out. I don't know the name of it, but they come out and they test the new video games coming out. So it can draw a crowd, such as also people that's into comic books, comic book characters and stuff like that, and I guess superhero characters where people go out and they dress up and they get together. People who listen to a particular music can be part of a culture, a subculture. Some people into with the different parts of rap music, trap music, drill music, I don't know, mumble rap. If the person's into gothic music or the gothic lifestyle, they have their own culture, which is their own language, their own style of dress. They got everything that kind of its members are aware of, and someone in the outside might question it, but the people on the inside, they understand it. Counterculture is a group of whose values, belief, norms, and related behaviors places members in opposition to the broader culture. I use the example of some of the biker groups. I don't want to say any particular names, but there are certain biker groups who, for instance, are certain groups of people who not only, I'm not saying that they're opposed to the culture, but they have their own rules and beliefs and values, how the society should be ran or what they believe to be right. So this is a counterculture to what's going on with the larger culture. So countercultures are groups whose values, beliefs, norms, and related behaviors place its members in opposition to the broader culture. They talk about this. I found this as well. Membership in a subculture is not easily awarded. Not only must high steel iron workers prove that they're able to work at great heights, but they fit in this group socially. They said newcomers are tested by members of the group, and they must demonstrate that they can take joking without offense. I know I'm not getting up there, but I admire those who do. But in certain type of subcultures and in certain groups, they might have initiations to become a member of a group, which is part of the subculture. They talk about the rodeo subcultures, subculture of Western subculture. The values that unites its members are reflected in their speech, clothing, and specialized activity. They use this as an example right here. This brave gentleman up here, as part of the subculture. They say the rodeo subculture. Really pluralistic society is a society made up of many different groups. The core values. Core values are the values that are central of a group, those around which it builds a common identity. And value contradiction, the values that contradict one another to follow the one meant to come into conflict with the other. So be familiar with like any type of group. These are the core values. These are the central of the group. These are the values that are central of the group. Like to say, but it helps build a common identity. And then a pluralistic is a society made up of many different groups and value contradictions, values that contradict one another to follow the one meant to come into contact with the conflict with the other. Some of the overview of U.S. values, achievement and success is one of the values that we have in U.S. culture. Individualism, they stated. I mean, I think it's more of a growing thing right now. Hard work, of course, efficiency and practicality, science and technology. We all want material comfort, and there's a form of freedom as well as far as the U.S. values. Democracy, equality, they say group superiority, education is always a value, religiosity and romantic love are some of the overview of U.S. values. Value cluster. Values that together form a larger whole. Success. In order to achieve success is education, hard work, material comfort, and individualism. Individualism is a form of success. There are probably other things, but nowadays they're looking at defining the success is you do have some form of material comfort, and you got that material comfort through hard work, and a lot of times the hard work and the success comes from your education. So always students stay in school, get your education. Do not try not to drop out of school. Remember that this is a chance of opportunity not only to advance your income, prestige, but also as a way to gain more money to live a more comfortable lifestyle. So stay in school. Emerging value cluster is leisure, self-fulfillment. I asked a student um, to describe young people today. He was about 18 or 19. So describe young people today, and he told me instant self-gratification. I asked other students, did they agree? They said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Instant self-gratification. Not everybody, but he just mentioned that that was the way he described young people today. Self-fulfillment, a lot of physical fitness, a lot of people working out, getting in shape. There's a lot of emphasis on that. Being youthfulness, staying young and healthy. And there's a lot of concern for the environment as well. Idea cultures are people's ideas, values, and norms, the goals held out for them. So these are the ideal culture that people experience. So once you go to school, get a good education, get a good job, entrepreneurship, get a career. Um, Ideally, if someone chooses to have a family or not, that's up to them. But these are the values of norms of getting hard work, determination to achieve a form of success. The real culture, the norms and values that people actually follow, as opposed to the idea culture. So some people say, "Oh, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to school, get education. I'm just going to sell drugs, stuff like that." So I know the idea culture, and I can get a little bit more when I talk about this in delinquency and crime. When you get to strain theory, that these are the norms people actually follow. They look at the idea culture and say, okay, that sounds good, but this is what I'm going to do. So ideal is what a group considers worth aiming for, and real is what people actually do. Technology in itself is a narrow sense. Tools, its broader sense, includes the skills or procedures necessary to make and use those tools. So, of course, technology is very important. It's constantly changing. New technology is the emerging technologies of an era that have a significant impact on social life. Of course, with the new technology, the globalization, things that I didn't think of in the 70s were possible that people are doing today. The things that are about to be happening in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, the things that's going to be going on. The new technology has impacted social life, even the media role. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you have ways of communicate with people across the world more easily accessible than years ago. The new technology in video games, the new technology in cell phones, the new technology in computers, the internet, everything, social media, social networking sites, that you are able to convey a message, YouTube, all kind of things that's going on, which is a new technology. And technology is very important to a culture. Cultural lag, Burns' term for human behavior lagging behind technological innovations. Other cultures may not have the access to the same technology, so therefore they may be lagging behind. And it also may affect their behavior as well because they lack the technological innovations. Cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural traits from one group to another. It includes both the material and non-material cultural traits. So it's the spread of cultural traits. You can go from different groups as a form of cultural diffusion. Cultural leveling, the process by which culture becomes similar to one another, refers especially to the process by which Western culture is being exported and diffused into the other nations. So that's a form of cultural leveling. Now we get into our sociological theories. I got to talk about the sociological theories. Of course, we're going to talk about the functionalist perspective. Remember, it views society as a system. Keyword is a system and is viewed a society, all in which all parts work together or function together to create society as a whole. In this way, societies need culture to exist. We need a culture. Think about over time, years ago, future, we need a culture. Cultural norms function to support the fluid operation of society, and cultural values guide people in making choices. Again, the cultural norms function to support the fluid operation of a society, and the cultural values guide people in making choices. So we need culture to exist. We need a form of culture to help guide us. We need norms in place to help us function. So that's the functionist perspective. And just as members of a society work together to fulfill a society's needs, culture exists to meet its members' basic needs. So just remember from the functionist perspective on culture. Functionalists also study culture in terms of values. Education is an important concept in the United States because it is valued. Of course, we value education. We want everybody to go to school. The functionalists say, hey, this is very important in forms of a culture. The culture of education includes material culture, classrooms, textbooks, libraries, dorms, supports the emphasis placed on the value of educating a society's members. That's why we need the culture to function properly according to the function's perspective. Conflict theory. At the core of a conflict theory is the effect of economic production and materialism, dependence on technology in rich nations versus a lack of technology and education in poor nations. And I'm going to talk about that in global stratification a little bit later. Conflict theorist believes that a society's system of material production has an effect on the rest of the culture. So there is that, with the conflict theory, there's this unequal distribution of power and wealth and economic production. And materialism, it varies. The first thing it says at the core of conflict theory is the effect of this economic production and materialism. Again, conflict theory believes that a society's system of material production has an effect on the rest of the culture. But like I said, I'll talk about that more, especially this part right here in the chapter on global stratification. People who have less power also have less ability to adapt to cultural change. Again, read it again. People who have less power also have less ability to adapt to cultural change. This view contrasts with the perspective of the functionalists. In the U.S. culture of capitalism, to illustrate, we continue to strive toward the promise of the American dream, which perpetuates the belief that the wealthy deserve their privilege. Remember, if you go back into Karl Marx, we talks about there are two types of classes, and they are in conflict with one another. And therefore, those who in power, they're trying to maintain their status of power and privilege, which would be the wealthy people. They state in this structure of capitalism, everybody wants the American dream, but they say it perpetuates that the belief that the wealthy deserve their privileges because those that are wealthy want to maintain their wealth and pass it on from one generation to the next. Conflict theorists view social structures as inherently unequal, based on power differentials related to issues like class, gender, race, and age. For conflict theorists, culture is seen as reinforcing issues of privilege for certain groups based upon race, sex, class, and so on. The conflict theory states that women strive for equality in a male-dominated society. Senior citizens struggle to protect their rights to health care and their independence from a younger generations of lawmakers. So there's always this conflict that's going on based upon the status, especially those in positions of power. Unequal status, unequal access to the same type of power. Symbolic interaction is a sociological perspective we talked about before that is most concerned with the face-to-face interaction between members of a society. We talked about that a lot about that in chapter 1, but interactionists see culture as being created and maintained by the ways people interact and how individuals interpret each other's actions. Proponents of this theory conceptualize human interactions as a continuous process of deriving meaning from both objects in the environment and the actions of others. This is where the term symbolic comes into play. Every object and action has a symbolic meaning, and language serves as a means for people to represent and communicate their interpretation of these meanings to others. Those who believe in symbolic interactionist actionism perceived culture is highly dynamic and fluid, as it is dependent on how meaning is interpreted and how individuals interact when conveying these meanings. So they're studying their face-to-face interaction on a micro level. So therefore, we remember there are different cultures. They're cross-cultured and around the world, but they're looking at it from that face-to-face interaction, how people interpret things and how people interact and how they convey messages back and forth. So remember, the symbolic interactions perspective continues to stay consistent. When you use an example of culture, they're going to examine the culture and look at the individuals and how they interact. What does it mean to each other persons as well? So we go into a little bit of culture. Reflection theory, the idea is that culture is a projection of social structures and relationships into public sphere, a screen into which the film of the underlying reality or social structures of a society is projected. So reflection theory is based upon just how you live and how a certain culture live, and they put out a projection as well as a way for people to understand their structure, and their relationships, and their culture. Which talks about the reality of how that society is being projected. So therefore, I look at reflection theory as if you put out a rap video or you put out a music video, some of the rap videos, it comes out, people talk about how they were living. Ice-T had a video years ago, a song called High Rollers. In the video, he talks about, with a song, he talks about being a drug dealer who has a lot of money, cars, houses, and he portrays this character of a drug dealer in this video. But at the same time, he's not really glorifying it. He's just saying this is what you have, because one of the themes of the song says you better watch your back if you want to be a high roller. And at the end of the video, he wound up getting killed. So he's showing people, okay, this might be same fun and it might be a quick cash, but these are the projections that happens in the reality of being a drug dealer, that someone can try to come kill you. Make sure you're familiar with reflection theory as well. Media, the mass media we talk about is any formats, platforms, or vehicles that carry, present, or communicate information. There are a lot of different forms of media. People got to understand that media both reflect the culture and work to produce the very culture that they represent, which is huge. Media, again, both reflect culture. If you think about it, the forms of the media, mass media, and they work to produce the very culture that they represent. So they send it out a message based upon the culture that they represent, and they're using the media as a tool. So remember, people create media. How the media shape the culture in which people live, it reflects the culture in which they exist, and how individuals and groups use the media as their own means to shape, redefine, and change culture. So it can be someone has a YouTube channel talking about certain things. Someone has, I believe, it's a podcast or something. The media can come in different ways. And then when you create the media, your own form of media, you have some people based upon the culture in which they live, and they're telling people, okay, well, this is the way to live, and they're using the media as a way to shape the culture so people can understand how they feel. They may want to change the culture, reshape the culture. Some people talk about, like one of my students talked about, how CNN has a particular culture that they represent, and they're using it as a platform to get people to understand how they feel, but they do want to shape the culture. Fox News may feel a certain way, CNN feel a certain way. So it's different ways of communication. I know individuals who have their own talk show, own radio show that talks about culture. So that's also very interesting. So I challenge students to just think about some of the different ways how the media can help shape a culture. Hegemony is a condition by which a dominant group uses its power to elicit the voluntary consent of the popular masses. It means getting people to go along with the status quo because it seems like it's the best course or the natural order of doing things. They say it takes place in the private institutions, the family, churches, and the media. This is a way of the dominant group. They say, well, if I'm going to convince the masses, popular masses of people, this is the way we should go, I'm going to use it through the form of the media as a way to get people to think a certain way. As they say, it seems like the best course or the natural order of doing things. And it takes place in the families, churches, and media, but it also is the realm of the private institutions. Well, that was the last slide for this particular chapter 3. Feel free to email me. Email me if you have any questions, anything. I hope you enjoyed the slide. So, for the exam purposes, review this. There will be questions on chapter 3. If any questions, again, feel free to email me.